The Plague, Part 1. The unusual events described in this chronicle occurred in the 1940s at Oran. Everyone agreed that, considering their somewhat extraordinary character, they were out of place there. For its ordinariness is what strikes one first about the town of Oran, which is merely a large French port on the Algerian coast, headquarters of the prefect of the French department. The town itself, let us admit, is ugly. It has a smug, placid air, and you need time to discover what it is. It makes it different from so many business centers in other parts of the world. How to conjure up a picture, for instance, of a town without pigeons, without any trees or gardens, where you never hear the beat of wings or the rustle of leaves, a thoroughly negative place, in short. The seasons are discriminated only in the sky. All that tells you of spring's coming is the feel of the air, or the baskets of flowers brought in from the suburbs by peddlers. It's a spring cried in the marketplaces. During the summer, the sun bakes the houses bone dry, sprinkles our walls with grayish dust, and you have no option but to survive those days of fire indoors, behind closed shutters. In autumn, on the other hand, we have deluges of mud. Only winter brings really pleasant weather. Perhaps the easiest way of making a town's acquaintance is to ascertain how the people in it work, how they love, and how they die. In our little town, is this, one wonders, an effect of the climate? All three are done on much the same lines, with the same feverish yet casual air. The truth is that everyone is bored and devotes himself to cultivating habits. Our citizens work hard, but solely with the object of getting rich. Their chief interest is in commerce, and their chief aim in life is, as they call it, doing business. Naturally, they don't eschew such simpler pleasures as lovemaking, sea-bathing, going to the pictures. But, very sensibly, they reserve these pastimes for Saturday afternoons and Sundays, and employ the rest of the week in making money as much as possible. In the evening, on leaving the office, they foregather at an hour that never varies. In the cafes, stroll the same boulevard, or take the air on their balconies. The passions of the young are violent and short-lived. The vices of older men seldom range beyond an addiction to bowling, to banquets and socials, or clubs where large sums yet change hands on the fall of a card. It will be said, no doubt, that these habits are not peculiar to our town. Really, all our contemporaries are much the same. Certainly nothing is commoner nowadays than to see people working from morn till night, and then proceeding to fritter away at card tables, in cafes, and in small talk what time is left for living. Nevertheless, there still exist towns and countries where people have now and then an inkling of something different. In general, it doesn't change their lives. Still, they have had an intimation, and that's so much to the good. Oran, however, seems to be a town without intimations, in other words, completely modern. Hence, I see no need to dwell on the manner of loving in our town. The men and women consume one another rapidly in what is called the act of love, or else settle down to a mild habit of conjugality. We seldom find a mean between these extremes. That, too, is not exceptional. At Oran, as elsewhere, for lack of time and thinking, people have to love one another without knowing much about it. What is more exceptional in our town is the difficulty one may experience there in dying. Difficulty, perhaps, is not the right word. Discomfort would come nearer. Being ill is never agreeable, but there are towns that stand by you, so to speak, when you are sick, in which you can, after a fashion, let yourself go. An invalid needs small attentions. He likes to have something to rely on, and that's natural enough. But at Oran, the violent extremes of temperature, the exigencies of business, the uninspiring surroundings, the sudden nightfalls, and the very nature of its pleasures call for good health. An invalid feels out of it there. Think what it must be for a dying man, trapped behind hundreds of walls all sizzling with heat, while the whole population, sitting in cafes or hanging on the telephone, is discussing shipments, bills of lading, discounts. It will then be obvious what discomfort attends death, even modern death, when it waylays you under such conditions in a dry place. These somewhat haphazard observations may give a fair idea of what our town is like. However, we must not exaggerate. Really, all that was to be conveyed was the banality of the town's appearance and of life in it. But you can get through the days there without trouble once you have formed habits. And since habits are precisely what our town encourages, all is for the best. Viewed from this angle, its life is not particularly exciting, that must be admitted. But, at least, social unrest is quite unknown among us. And our frank-spoken, amiable, and industrious citizens have always inspired a reasonable esteem in visitors. Treeless, glamourless, soulless, the town of Oran ends by seeming restful, and after a while you go complacently to sleep there. It is only fair to add that Oran is grafted onto a unique landscape in the center of a bare plateau, ringed with luminous hills and above a perfectly shaped bay. All we may regret is the town's being so disposed that it turns its back on the bay, with the result that it's impossible to see the sea. You always have to go look for it. Such being the normal life of Oran, it will be easily understood that our fellow citizens had not the faintest reason to apprehend the incidents that took place in the spring of the year in question, and were, as we subsequently realized, premonitory signs of the grade of events we are to chronicle. To some, these events will seem quite natural, to others all but incredible. But obviously, a narrator cannot take account of these differences of outlook. His business is only to say, "This is what happened," when he knows that it actually did happen, that it closely affected the life of a whole populace, and that there are thousands of eyewitnesses who can appraise in their hearts the truth of what he writes. In any case, the narrator, whose identity will be made known in due course, would have little claim to competence for a task like this, had not chance put him in the way of gathering much information, and had he not been, by the force of things, closely involved in all that he proposes to narrate. This is his justification for playing the part of an historian. Naturally, a historian, even an amateur, always has data, personal or at second hand, to guide him. The present narrator has three kinds of data. First, what he saw himself. Secondly, the accounts of other eyewitnesses. Thanks to the part he played, he was enabled to learn their personal impressions from all those figuring in this chronicle. And lastly, documents that subsequently came into his hands. He proposes to draw on these records whenever this seems desirable, and to employ them as he thinks best. He also proposes, but perhaps the time has come to drop preliminaries and cautionary remarks, and to launch into the narrative proper. The account of the first days needs giving in some detail. When leaving his surgery on the morning of April 16th, Dr. Bernard Roux felt something soft under his foot. It was a dead rat lying in the middle of the landing. On the spur of the moment, he kicked it to one side, and, without giving it a further thought, continued on his way downstairs. Only when he was stepping out into the street did it occur to him that a dead rat had no business to be on his landing, and he turned back to ask the concierge of the building to see its removal. It was not until he noticed old M. Michel's reaction to the news that he realized the peculiar nature of his discovery. Personally, he had thought the presence of the dead rat rather odd, no more than that. The concierge, however, was genuinely outraged. On one point he was categorical. There weren't no rats here. In vain, the doctor assured him that there was a rat, presumably dead, on the second-floor landing. M. Michel's conviction wasn't to be shaken. There weren't no rats in the building, he repeated. so someone must have brought him this one from outside. Some youngster trying to be funny, most likely. That evening, when Dr. Rue was standing in the entrance, feeling for the latchkey in his pocket before starting up the stairs to his apartment, he saw a big rat coming toward him from the dark end of the passage. It moved uncertainly, and its fur was sopping wet. The animal stopped and seemed to be trying to get its balance, moved forward again toward the doctor, halted again, then spun round on itself with a little squeal and fell on its side. Its mouth was slightly open and blood was spurting from it. After gazing at it for a moment, the doctor went upstairs. He wasn't thinking about the rat. That glimpse of spurting blood had switched his thoughts back to something that had been on his mind all day. His wife, who had been ill for a year now, was due to leave next day for a sanatorium in the mountains. He found her lying down in the bedroom, resting, as he had asked her to do, in view of the exhausting journey before her. She gave him a smile. "Do you know, I'm feeling ever so much better," she said. The doctor gazed down at the face that turned toward him in the glow of the bedside lamp. His wife was 30, and the long illness had left its mark on her face. Yet the thought that came to Rue's mind as he gazed at her was, how young she looks, almost like a little girl. But perhaps that was because of the smile, which effaced all else. "Now try to sleep," he counseled. "The nurse is coming at 11, you know, and you have to catch the midday train." He kissed the slightly moist forehead. The smile escorted him to the door. Next day, April 17, at 8 o'clock, the concierge buttonholed the doctor as he was going out. Some young scallywags, he said, had dumped 3 dead rats in the hall. They'd obviously been caught in traps with very strong springs, as they were bleeding profusely. The concierge had lingered in the doorway for quite a while, holding the rats by their legs and keeping a sharp eye on the passers-by, on the off chance that the miscreants would give themselves away by grinning or by some facetious remark. His watch had been in vain. "But I'll nab 'em all right," said M. Michel hopefully. Much puzzled, Rue decided to begin his round in the outskirts of the town, where his poorer patients lived. The scavenging in these districts was done late in the morning, and as he drove his car along the straight, dusty streets, he cast glances at the garbage cans aligned along the side of the sidewalk. In one street alone, the doctor counted as many as a dozen rats deposited on the vegetable and other refuse in the cans. He found his first patient, an asthma case of long standing, in bed in a room that served as both dining room and bedroom and overlooked the street. The invalid was an old Spaniard with a hard, rugged face. Placed on the coverlet in front of him were 2 pots containing dried peas. When the doctor entered, the old man was sitting up, bending his neck back, gasping, and wheezing in his efforts to recover his breath. His wife brought a bowl of water. "Well, doctor," he said, while the injection was being made, "they're coming out, have you noticed?" "The rats, he means," his wife explained. "The man next door found 3. They're coming out. You can see them in all the trash cans. It's hunger." Rue soon discovered that the rats were the great topic of conversation in that part of town. After his round of visits, he drove home. "There's a telegram for you, sir, upstairs," M. Michel informed him. The doctor asked him if he'd seen any more rats. "No," the concierge replied. "There ain't been any more. I'm keeping a sharp lookout, you know. Those youngsters wouldn't dare when I'm around." The telegram informed Rue that his mother would be arriving next day. She was going to keep house for her son during his wife's absence. When the doctor entered his apartment, he found the nurse already there. He looked at his wife. She was in a tailor-made suit, and he noticed that she had used rouge. He smiled to her. "That's splendid," he said. "You're looking very nice." A few minutes later, he was seeing her into the sleeping car. She glanced round the compartment. "It's too expensive for us, really, isn't it?" "It had to be done," Rue replied. "What's this story about rats that's going around?" "I can't explain it. It certainly is queer, but it'll pass." Then, hurriedly, he begged her to forgive him. He felt he should have looked after her better. He'd been most remiss. When she shook her head, as if to make him stop, he added, "Anyhow, once you're back, everything will be better. We'll make a fresh start." "That's it." Her eyes were sparkling. "Let's make a fresh start." But then she turned her head and seemed to be gazing through the car window at the people on the platform, jostling one another in their haste. The hissing of the locomotive reached their ears. Gently he called his wife's first name. When she looked round, he saw her face wet with tears. "Don't," he murmured. Behind the tears, the smile returned, a little tense. She drew a deep breath. "Now off you go. Everything will be all right." He took her in his arms, then stepped back on the platform. Now he could only see her smile through the window. "Please, dear," he said, "take great care of yourself." But she could not hear him. As he was leaving the platform, near the exit, he met Mr. Othon, the police magistrate, holding his small boy by the hand. The doctor asked him if he was going away. Tall and dark, Mr. Othon had something of the air of what used to be called a man of the world, and something of an undertaker's assistant. "No," the magistrate replied. "I've come to meet Madame Othon, who's been to present her respects to my family." The engine whistled. "These rats now?" the magistrate began. Rue made a brief movement in the direction of the train, then turned back toward the exit. "The rats?" he said. "It's nothing." The only impression of that moment, which afterwards he could recall, was the passing of a railroad man with a box full of dead rats under his arm. Early in the afternoon of that day, when his consultations were beginning, a young man called on Rue. The doctor gathered that he had called before in the morning and was a journalist by profession. His name was Raymond Rambert. Short, square-shouldered, with a determined-looking face and keen, intelligent eyes, he gave the impression of someone who could keep his end up in any circumstances. He wore a sports type of clothes. He came straight to the point. His newspaper, one of the leading Paris dailies, had commissioned him to make a report on the living conditions prevailing among the Arab population, and especially on the sanitary conditions. Rue replied that these conditions were not good, but before he said any more, he wanted to know if the journalist would be allowed to tell the truth. "Certainly," Rambert replied. "I mean," Rue explained, "would you be allowed to publish an unqualified condemnation of the present state of things?" "Unqualified? Well, no, I couldn't go that far. But surely things aren't quite so bad as that." "No," Rue said quietly. "They weren't so bad as that." He had put the question solely to find out if Rambert could or couldn't state the facts without paltering with the truth. "I've no use for statements in which something is kept back," he added. "That is why I shall not furnish information in support of yours." The journalist smiled. "You talk the language of Saint Just." Without raising his voice, Rue said he knew nothing about that. The language he used was that of a man who was sick and tired of the world he lived in, though he had much liking for his fellow men and had resolved, for his part, to have no truck with injustice and compromises with the truth. His shoulders hunched, Rambert gazed at the doctor for some moments without speaking. Then, "I think I understand you," he said, getting up from his chair. The doctor accompanied him to the door. "It's good of you to take it like that," he said. Yes, I understand," Rambert repeated, with what seemed a hint of impatience in his voice. "Sorry to have troubled you." When shaking hands with him, Rue suggested that if he was out for curious stories for his paper, he might say something about the extraordinary number of dead rats that were being found in the town just now. Ah, Rambert explained, that certainly interests me. On his way out at 5 for another round of visits, the doctor passed on the stairway a stocky, youngish man with a big, deeply furrowed face and bushy eyebrows. He had met him once or twice in the top-floor apartment, which was occupied by some male Spanish dancers. Puffing a cigarette, Jean Perrault was gazing down at the convulsions of a rat dying on the step in front of him. He looked up, and his gray eyes remained fixed on the doctor for some moments. Then, after wishing him a good day, he remarked that it was rather odd, the way all these rats were coming out of their holes to die. Very odd, Rue agreed, and it ends by getting on one's nerves. In a way, Doctor, only in a way. We've not seen anything of the sort before, that's all. Personally, I find it interesting. Yes, definitely interesting. Tarot ran his fingers through his hair to brush it off his forehead, looked again at the rat, which had now stopped moving, then smiled toward Rue. But really, Doctor, it's the concierge's headache, isn't it? As it so happened, the concierge was the next person Rue encountered. He was leaning against the wall beside the street door. He was looking tired, and his normally rubicund face had lost its color. Yes, I know, the old man told Rue, who had informed him of the latest casualty among the rats. I keep finding him by 2s and 3s, but it's the same thing in the other houses in the street. He seemed depressed and worried, and was scratching his neck absent-mindedly. Rue asked him how he felt. The concierge wouldn't go so far as to say he was feeling ill. Still, he wasn't feeling quite up to the mark. In his opinion, it was just due to worry. These damned rats had given him a shock, like. It would be a relief when they stopped coming out and dying all over the place. Next morning, it was April 18, when the doctor was bringing back his mother from the station. He found M. Michel looking still more out of sorts. The stairway from the cellar to the attics was strewn with dead rats, 10 or a dozen of them. The garbage can of all the houses in the street were full of rats. The doctor's mother took it quite calmly. It's like that sometimes, she said vaguely. She was a small woman with silver hair and dark, gentle eyes. I'm so glad to be with you again, Bernard, she added. The rats can't change that anyhow. He nodded. It was a fact that everything seemed easy when she was there. However, he rang up the municipal office. He knew the man in charge of the department concerned with the extermination of vermin, and he asked him if he'd heard about all the rats that were coming out to die in the open. Yes, Mercier knew all about it. In fact, 50 rats had been found in his offices, which were near the wharves. To tell the truth, he was rather perturbed. Did the doctor think it meant anything serious? Rue couldn't give a definite opinion, but he thought the sanitary service should take action of some kind. Mercier agreed. And if you think it's really worth the trouble, I'll get an order issued as well. It certainly is worth the trouble, Rue replied. His charwoman had just told him that several hundred dead rats had been collected in the big factory where her husband worked. It was about this time that our townsfolk began to show signs of uneasiness. For from April 18 onwards, quantities of dead or dying rats were found in factories and warehouses. In some cases, the animals were killed to put an end to their agony. From the outer suburbs to the center of the town, in all the byways where the doctor's duties took him, in every thoroughfare, rats were piled up in garbage cans or lying in long lines in the gutters. The evening papers that day took up the matter and inquired whether or not the city fathers were going to take steps and what emergency measures were contemplated. to abate this particularly disgusting nuisance. Actually, the municipality had not contemplated doing anything at all, but now a meeting was convened to discuss the situation. An order was transmitted to the sanitary service to collect the dead rats at daybreak every morning. When the rats had been collected, 2 municipal trucks were to take them to be burned in the town incinerator. But the situation worsened in the following days. There were more and more dead vermin in the streets, and the collectors had bigger truckloads every morning. On the 4th day, the rats had begun to come out and die in batches. From basements, cellars, and sewers they emerged in long, wavering files into the light of day, swayed helplessly, then did a sort of pirouette and fell dead at the feet of the horrified onlookers. At night, in passages and alleys, their shrill little death cries could be clearly heard. In the mornings, the bodies were found lining the gutters, each with a gout of blood, like a red flower, on its tapering muzzle. Some were bloated and already beginning to rot, others rigid, with their whiskers still erect. Even in the busy heart of the town, you found them piled in little heaps on landings and in backyards. Some stole forth to die singly in the halls of public offices, in school playgrounds, and even on cafe terraces. Our townsfolk were amazed to find such busy centers as the Place d'Armes, the boulevards, the promenade along the waterfront, dotted with repulsive little corpses. After the daily cleanup of